Hey guys. So we are at the last three chapters of Mockingbird. Have my Mockingbird cup. I have my Mockingbird tea. But most fun of anything is my Mockingbird pin. You see what that is? It's a little ham with feet. Yep. So today I wear our little ham on my shirt because Scout, see, I got my little ham. Scout is definitely our little ham. So the kids have been attacked. Wow. And Jim has been hurt. His arm has been broken the opposite way at the elbow. Ew. Woof. So we are ready to bring home the last three chapters. Be sure that you are checking your email, making sure that you have all the deadlines and things to get done. And we are going to be meeting in the Miller Zoom room next week to watch the movie. Okay. So, we ready for the last three chapters? I have my tissues. I'm ready. I'm ready to go. Here we go. Miller's on board. Okay. Aunt Alexander got up and she reached for the mantelpiece. Mr. Tate rose, but she declined assistance. For once in his life, Atticus's instinctive courtesy failed him. He sat where he was. Somehow I could think of nothing but Mr. Bobby Ewell saying he'd get Atticus if it took him the rest of his life. Mr. Ewell almost got him, and it was the last thing he did. Are you sure? Said Atticus bleakly. Well, he's dead, all right, said Mr. Tate. He's good and dead. He won't hurt those children again. I didn't mean that. Atticus seemed to be talking in his sleep. His age was beginning to show his one sign of inner turmoil. The strong line of his jaw melted a little, and one became aware of the telltale creases forming around his eyes, and one noticed not his jet black hair, but the gray patches growing in around his temple. Sometimes I think you guys give me my gray patches. Hadn't we better go to the living room? Aunt Alexandra said at last. If you don't mind, said Mr. Tate, I'd rather us stay in here if it won't hurt Jim any. I want to have a look at his injuries while Scout tells us about it. Well, is it all right if I leave? She asked. I'm just one person too many in here, and I'll be in the next room if you want me, Atticus. Aunt Alexander went to the door, but she stopped and turned. Atticus, I had a feeling about this tonight. This is my fault, she began. I should have. And Mr. Tate held up his hand. You go ahead, Miss Alexander. I know it's been a shock to you. And don't you fret yourself about anything. Why, if we followed our feelings all the time, we'd be like cats chasing our tails. Miss Scout, if you can tell us what happened while it's still fresh in your mind, you think you can? Did you see him following you? Well, I went to Atticus and I felt his arms go around me, and I buried my head in his lap. We started home, I said, and Jim, I forgot my shoelaces. And soon we'd started back from the lights went out, and Jim said I could get them tomorrow. Scout, raise up so Mr. Tate can hear you, Atticus said, and I crawled into his lap. And then Jim said, hush a minute. And I thought he was thinking, well, he always wants you to hush so he can think. And then he said he heard something, and we thought it was Cecil. Cecil? Well, Cecil Jacobs. He scared us once tonight, and we thought it was him again. And he had on a sheet, and, well, they gave a quarter for the best costume, and I don't know who won it. Where were you when you thought it was Cecil? Well, just a little piece from the schoolhouse. I yelled something at him. You yelled what? Oh, Cecil Jacobs is a big fat hen, I think. We didn't hear nothing. And then Jim yelled, hello, or something loud enough to wake the dead. Just a minute, Scout, said Mr. Tate. Mr. Finch, did you hear them? Atticus said he didn't. He had the radio on, and Aunt Alexandra had hers going in her bedroom, and he remembered because she told him to turn his down a bit so she could hear hers. Atticus smiled. I always play the radio a bit too loud. I wonder if the neighbors heard anything, said Mr. Tate. I doubt it, Hick. Most of them listen to their radios or go up to bed with the chickens. Maudie Atkinson may have been up, but I doubt it. Go ahead, Scout, Mr. Tate said. Well, after Jim yelled, we walked on, and Mr. Tate, I was shut up in my costume, but I could hear it myself then. The footsteps, I mean, they walked when we walked and stopped when we stopped. And Jim said he could see me because Mrs. Crenshaw put some kind of shiny paint on my costume. I was a ham. Okay, a ham. How's that? Asked Mr. Tate, startled. Atticus described my role to Mr. Tate, plus the construction of my garment. Well, you should have seen her when she came in. He said it was crushed to a pulp. Mr. Tate rubbed his chin. Well, I wondered why he had those marks on him. His sleeves were perforated with little holes, and there were one or two little puncture marks on his arms to match the holes. Let me see that thing, if you will, sir. And Atticus, he fetched the remains of my costume, and Mr. Tate, he turned it around and he bent it around to get an idea of its former shape. This thing probably saved her life, he said. Look. He pointed with a long forefinger. A shiny, clean line stood out on the dull wire. Bobby, well, meant business. He was out of his mind, said Atticus. Well, I don't like to contradict you, Mr. Finch. He wasn't crazy. Mean as hell. Low down skunk with enough liquor in him to make him brave enough to kill children. He'd never met you face to face. Atticus shook his head. I cannot conceive of a man who. Mr. Finch, there's just some kind of men you have to shoot before you say Heidi to them. And even then, they aren't worth the bullet it takes to shoot them. And Ewell's one of them. Atticus said, I thought he got it all out of him the day he threatened me. And even if he hadn't, I thought he'd come after me. Well, he had guts enough to pester a poor colored woman. He had guts enough to pester Judge Taylor when he thought the house was empty. So why do you think he'd have met you face to face in the daylight? Mr. Tate sighed. We better get on, Scout. You heard him behind you. Yes, sir. And when we got under the tree, how'd you know you were under the tree? You couldn't see thunder out there. Well, I was barefooted. And Jim says the ground's always cooler under a tree. Well, we'll have to make him a deputy. Go ahead. Well, then all of a sudden, something grabbed me and mashed my costume. I think I ducked on the ground, and I heard a tussling out under the tree, sort of. Well, they were bamming against the trunk, and they sounded like it. Jim found me, started pulling me toward the road, and Mr. Ewell yanked him down, I reckon, and they tussled some more. And then there was this funny noise, and Jim hollered. I stopped. That was Jim's arm. Anyway, Jim hollered, and I didn't hear him anymore. And the next thing, Mr. Ewell was trying to squeeze me to death. Well, I reckon. I mean, then somebody yanked Mr. Ewell down, and Jim must have got up, I guess, and that's all I know. And then Mr. Tate was looking at me sharply. Well, somebody was staggering around and panting and coughing, fit to die. Well, I thought it was Jim at first, but it didn't sound like him. So I went looking for Jim on the ground, and I thought Atticus had come to help us and had got wore out. Who was it? Well, there he is, Mr. Tate. He can tell you his name. And as I said it, I half pointed to the man in the corner, but I brought my arm down quickly, lest Atticus reprimand me for pointing. He was impolite to point. He was still leaning against the wall, and he'd been leaning against the wall when I came into the room, and his arms folded across his chest. And as I pointed, he brought his arms down and he pressed the palms of his hands against the wall. They were white hands, sickly white hands that had never seen the sun, so white that they stood out garishly against that dull cream wall in the dim light of Jim's room. And I looked from his hands to his sand-stained khaki pants, and my eyes traveled up his thin frame to his torn denim shirt, and his face was as white as his hands, but for a shadow on his jutting chin. And his cheeks were thin to hollowness, and his mouth was white, and there were shallow, almost delicate indentations at his temples, and his gray eyes were so colorless, I thought he was blind. His hair was dead and thin, almost feathery on top of his head. And when I pointed to him, his palms slipped slightly, leaving greasy sweat stains on the wall, and he hooked his thumbs in his belt. A strange small spasm shook him, as if he heard fingernails scrape slate. But as I gazed at him in wonder, the tension slowly drained from his face, and his lips parted into a timid smile. And our neighbor's image blurred with my sudden tears. "Hey, Boo," I said. "Mr. Arthur, honey," said Atticus, gently correcting me. "Now, Jean Louise, this is Mr. Arthur Radley, and I believe he already knows you." Well, if Atticus could blandly introduce me to Boo Radley at a time like this, well, that was Atticus. Boo saw me run instinctively to the bed where Jim was sleeping, for the same shy smile crept across his face. Hot with embarrassment, I tried to cover up by covering Jim up. Don't touch him," Atticus said. Mr. Hectate sat looking intently at Boo through his horn-rimmed glasses, and he was about to speak when Dr. Reynolds came down the hall. "Everybody out," he said as he came in the door. "Evening, Arthur. I didn't notice you the first time I was here." Well, Dr. Reynolds' voice was as breezy as his step, as though he had said it every evening of his life. An announcement that astounded me even more than being in the same room with Boo Radley. Well, of course, I mean, even Boo Radley got sick sometimes, I thought, but on the other hand, I wasn't sure. Dr. Reynolds was carrying a big package wrapped in newspaper, and he put it down on Jim's desk, and he took off his coat. You're quite satisfied he's alive now?" Let me tell you how I knew. When I tried to examine him, he kicked me. Had to put him out good and proper to touch him. So, scat, he said to me. Said Atticus, glancing at Boo. "Heck, let's go out on the front porch. There's plenty of chairs out there. It's still warm enough." Now, I was wondering why Atticus was inviting us to the front porch instead of the living room, and then I understood. The living room lights were awfully strong, and we filed out. First, Mr. Tate, and Atticus was waiting at the door for him to go ahead of him, and then he changed his mind, and he followed Mr. Tate. Now, people have a habit of doing everyday things, even under the oddest conditions, and I was no exception. Come along, Mr. Arthur, I heard myself saying. You don't know the house real well. I'll just take you to the porch, sir. And he looked down at me and nodded. And I led him through the hall and past the living room. Won't you have a seat, Mr. Arthur? This rocking chair's nice and comfortable. My small fantasy about him was alive again. He'd be sitting on the porch. Right, pretty spell we're having it, isn't it, Mr. Arthur? Yep, a right pretty spell. Well, feeling slightly unreal, I led him to the chair farthest from Atticus and Mr. Tate. It was in deep shadow. Boo would feel more comfortable in the dark. Now, Atticus was sitting in the swing, and Mr. Tate was in a chair next to him. And the light from the living room windows was strong on them, and I sat beside Boo. Well, heck, Atticus was saying, I guess the thing to do. Good Lord, I'm losing my memory. Atticus pushed up his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes. All right, Jim's not quite 13. No, he's already 13. I can't remember. Anyway, it'll come before the county court. What will, Mr. Finch? Mr. Tate uncrossed his legs and leaned forward. Well, of course it was clear-cut self-defense, but I'll have to go to the office and hunt. Mr. Finch, do you think Jim killed Bob Ewell? Do you think that? Well, you heard what Scout said. There's no doubt about it. She said Jim got up and he yanked him off her, and he probably got a hold of Ewell's knife, and somehow in the dark, we were going to find out tomorrow. Mr. Finch, hold on, said Mr. Tate. Jim never stabbed Bob Ewell. Atticus was silent for a minute, and he looked at Mr. Tate as if he appreciated what he said, but Atticus shook his head. Heck, it's mighty kind of you. And I know you're doing it from that good heart of yours, but don't start anything like that. Mr. Tate got up and he went to the edge of the porch and he spat into the shrubbery, and then he thrust his hands into his hip pockets and he faced Atticus. Like what? He said. I'm sorry if I spoke sharply, heck, Atticus said simply, but nobody's hushing this up. I don't live that way. Nobody's going to hush anything up, Mr. Finch. Now, Mr. Tate's voice was quiet, but his boots were planted so solidly on the porch floorboards, it seemed they grew there. Now, a curious contest, the nature of which eluded me, was developing between my father and the sheriff. Now, it was Atticus's turn to get up and go to the edge of the porch, and he said, and he spat dryly into the yard. And he put his hands in his pockets and he faced Mr. Tate. Heck, you haven't said it, but I know what you're thinking, and I thank you for it. Jean Louise, he turned to me. You said Jim yanked Mr. Ewell off of you. Yes, sir. Well, that's what I thought. I see there, Heck. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. But I don't want any boy starting out something like this over his head. The best thing to clear the air is to have it all out in the open. Let the county come and bring their sandwiches. I don't want him growing up with a whisper about him. I don't want anybody saying, well, Jim Finch and his daddy paid a mint to get him out of it. The sooner we get this over, the better. Mr. Finch, Mr. Tate said stolidly, Bob Ewell fell on his knife. He killed himself. Atticus walked to the corner of the porch and he looked at the wisteria vine, and in his own way, I thought each was as stubborn as the other. I wondered who would give in first. Atticus's stubbornness was quiet and rarely evident, but in some ways he was as set as the Cunninghams. Now, Mr. Tate's was unschooled and blunt, but it was equal to my father's. Heck, Atticus's back was turned. If this thing's hushed up, it'll be a simple denial to Jim of the way I tried to raise him. Sometimes I think I'm a total failure as a parent, but I'm all they've got. Before Jim looks at anyone else, he looks at me, and I've tried to live so I can look squarely back at him. And if I've connived at something like this, frankly, I couldn't meet his eye. And the day I can't do that, I know I've lost him. And I don't want to lose him. And Scout, because they're all I've got. Mr. Finch, Mr. Tate was still planted on the floorboards. Bobby Will fell on his knife. I can prove it. Atticus wheeled around and he dug his hands into his pockets. Heck, can't you try and see it my way? You've got children of your own, but I'm older than you. And when my children are grown, I'll be an old man if I'm still around. But right now, and if they don't trust me, they won't trust anybody. And Jim and Scout know what happened. And if they hear of me saying downtown something different happened, I, I, I won't have them anymore. I can't live one way in town and another way in my home. Well, Mr. Tate rocked on his heels and said patiently, he'd flung Jim down. He stumbled over a root under that tree. Oh, and look, I can show you. Now, Mr. Tate reached in his side pocket and he withdrew a long switchblade knife. And as he did so, excuse me, Dr. Reynolds came to the door. The deceased's under that tree, doctor, just inside the schoolyard. You got a flashlight? You better have this one. I can ease around and turn my car lights on, said Dr. Reynolds, and he took Mr. Tate's flashlight. Jim's all right. He won't wake up tonight, I hope. So don't worry. That the knife that killed him, Heck? No, sir. Still in him. Looked like a kitchen knife from the handle, and Ken ought to be here with the hearse by now, doctor. Right. Mr. Tate flicked open the knife. It was like this, he said, and he held the knife and he pretended to stumble, and as he leaned forward under his left arm, it went under in front of him. See there? Stabbed himself through that soft stuff between his ribs. His whole weight drove it in. Mr. Tate closed the knife and he jammed it back in his pocket. Scout's 8 years old, he said. She was too scared to know exactly what went on. You'd be surprised, Atticus said grimly. Well, I'm not saying she made it up. I'm saying she was too scared to know exactly what happened. And it was mighty dark out there, black as ink. And it takes somebody mighty used to the dark to make a competent witness. I won't have it, Atticus said softly. Damn it, I'm not thinking of Jim. Mr. Tate's boot hit the floorboard so hard the lights in Miss Monty's bedroom went on. Miss Stephanie Crawford's lights went on. Atticus and Mr. Tate, they looked across the street, then at each other, and waited. Then Mr. Tate spoke again. His voice was barely audible. Mr. Finch, I hate to fight you when you're like this. You've been under a strain tonight no man should ever have to go through. Now, why ain't you in the bed? From it, I don't know. But I do know that for once you haven't been able to put two and two together. We've got to settle this tonight because tomorrow it'll be too late. Bobby Will's got a kitchen knife in his craw. Now, Mr. Tate added that if Atticus wasn't going to stand there and maintain that any boy Jim's size with a busted arm had fight enough left in him to tackle and kill a grown man in the pitch dark. Well, heck, said Atticus abruptly. That was a switchblade you were waving. Where'd you get it? Took it off a drunk man. Mr. Tate answered coolly. I was trying to remember. Now, Mr. Ewell was on me, and then he went down. Jim must have gotten up. Well, at least that's what I thought. Heck, I said I took it off a drunk man downtown tonight. Ewell probably found that kitchen knife in the dump somewhere, honed it down, and bided his time. Just bided his time. Atticus made his way to the swing and sat down. His hands dangled limply between his knees. He was looking at the floor. He had moved with the same slowness that night in front of the jail when I thought it took him forever to fold his newspaper and toss it in his chair. Mr. Tate clumped softly around the porch. It ain't your decision, Mr. Finch. It's all mine. It's my decision and my responsibility. And for once, if you don't see it my way, well, there's not much you can do about it. And if you want to try, I'll call you a liar to your face. Uh-huh. Your boy never stabbed Bob Ewell, he said slowly. Didn't come near a mile of it. And now you know it. All he wanted to do was get him and his sister safely home. Mr. Tate stopped pacing, and he stopped in front of Atticus, and his back was to us. I'm not a very good man, sir, but I am sheriff of Macomb County, and I've lived in this town all my life, and I'm going on 43 years old. Know everything that's happened here since before I was born. There's a black boy dead for no reason, and the man responsible for it is dead. Let the dead bury the dead this time, Mr. Finch. Let the dead bury the dead. Now, Mr. Tate went to the swing and he picked up his hat, and it was lying beside Atticus. And Mr. Tate pushed back his hair and put his hat on. I never heard tell that it was against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. So, who actually took out Bobby? Boo did. Boo has been watching, and Boo is watching for his kids. And Boo left that house, took out Bobby Well to save those children, and brought them home. Okay. So Heck is now saying we know who killed him. Nobody is going to mourn Bobby Well's death, not even those children out on the farm. Think about it, guys. It will be a relief not to have to deal with that man again. Okay? I never heard tell that it was against the law for a citizen to do his utmost to prevent a crime from being committed, which is exactly what he did. But maybe you'll say it's my duty to tell the town all about it and not hush it up. And you know what's going to happen then? All the ladies in Macomb, including my wife, they'd be knocking on his door, bringing angel food cakes. And to my way of thinking, Mr. Finch, taking the one man who's done you and this town a great service and dragging him with his shy ways into the limelight, to me, that's a sin. It's a sin, and I'm not going to have it on my head. If it was any other man, it'd be different, but not this man, Mr. Finch. So everybody's talked about Boo since this whole thing went down when he was a teenager. But now he saves the kids. But now Boo is also an agoraphobic. He stays away, he chooses to stay in and away from people. It is the lifestyle he has chosen. It's what he's used to. Now, if they send out a parade and start banging the drums and the cymbals and going, look what Arthur Radley did. Yeah, everybody's going to be like, oh my gosh, Boo, this is Arthur Radley. This is great. And then they're going to mean well, but it's going to freak Arthur out, having everybody and their dog in his jam. That's not good either. And then there will always be some of those that say, see, Arthur Radley, that's why he's been locked up all this time. He's bad, bad, bad. Come on. Come on. Okay. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole. And I spilled my coffee. And I got a dog barking. And I spritzed her because she's annoying. Can you hear? Okay. All right. So Tate has got, that's why Sheriff Tate, he's like, no, Bobby well fell on his knife, cut and dried. The kids are okay. Arthur's okay. Arthur did the right thing, but we are not bringing this to light. We are not causing a ruckus with Arthur. That's a sin. Arthur's our mockingbird as well. Boo is our mockingbird. He is a good man, but it will shoot him down either way. Doesn't matter. Think about what Stephanie Crawford would have. She'd have a field day with this, as would everybody else. It's a sin to shoot the mockingbird. We keep the mockingbirds safe. Get rid of the blue jays. And remember what I said, we all have blue jay moments, but if someone is a true blue jay, woof. Woof. Okay? Yep, I'm snotting already. Mr. Tate was trying to dig a hole in the floor with the toe of his boot, and he pulled his nose and then he massaged his left arm. I may not be much, Mr. Finch, but I'm still sheriff of Macomb County, and Bobby Well fell on his knife. Good night, sir. Mr. Tate stamped off the porch and strode across the front yard, and his car door slammed and he drove away. And Atticus sat looking at the floor for a long time, and finally he raised his head. Scout, he said, Mr. Ewell fell on his knife. Can you possibly understand? Well, Atticus looked like he needed some cheering up, and I ran to him and I hugged him. I kissed him with all his might, with my might. Well, yes, sir, I understand, I reassured him. Mr. Tate was right. Atticus disengaged himself and he looked at me. What do you mean? Well, it's like shooting a mockingbird, isn't it? And Atticus put his face in my hair and he rubbed it. And when he got up and walked across the porch into the shadows, his youthful step had returned. And before he went in the house, he stopped in front of Boo Radley. Thank you for my children, Arthur, he said. Now, when Boo Radley shuffled his feet, light from the living room windows glistened on his forehead, and every move he made was uncertain, as if he wasn't sure that his hands and his feet would make proper contact with the things he touched. And he coughed this dreadful railing cough, and he was so shaken he had to sit down. His hands searched for his hip pocket and he pulled out a handkerchief and he coughed into it, and then he wiped his forehead. Well, having been so accustomed to his absence, I found it incredible that he'd been sitting beside me all this time, present. He hadn't made a sound. Once more, he got to his feet and he turned to me and he nodded towards the front door. You'd like to say goodnight to Jim, wouldn't you, Mr. Arthur? Come right in. I led him down the hall. Aunt Alexandra was sitting by Jim's bed. Come in, Arthur, she said. He's still asleep. Dr. Reynolds gave him a heavy sedative. Hey, Louise, is your father in the living room? Yes, ma'am, I think so. I'll just go speak to him for a minute. Dr. Reynolds left. Her voice trailed away. Boo had drifted to a corner of the room where he stood with his chin up, peering from a distance at Jim. And I took him by the hand surprisingly warm for its whiteness, and I tugged him a little, and he allowed me to lead him to Jim's bed. Dr. Reynolds had made a tent-like arrangement over Jim's arm to keep the cover off the gas, and Boo leaned forward and looked over it, and an expression of Timid curiosity was on his face, as though he'd never seen a boy before. His mouth was slightly open, and he looked at Jim from head to foot. And Boo's hand came up, but he let it drop to his side. Oh, you can pet him, Mr. Arthur. He's asleep. You couldn't if he was awake, though. He wouldn't let you. I found myself explaining. Go ahead. Boo's hand hovered on Jim's head. Oh, go on, sir. He's asleep. And his hand came down lightly on Jim's hair. I was beginning to learn his body English. His hands tightened on mine, and he indicated he wanted to leave. I led him to the front porch where his uneasy steps halted. He was still holding my hand, and he gave no sign of letting me go. Will you take me home? He almost whispered it, the voice of a child afraid of the dark. I put my foot on the top step and stopped. I would lead him through our house, but I would never lead him home. Mr. Arthur, you bend your arm down here, like that. That's right, sir. And I slipped my hand into the crook of his left arm. He had to stoop a little to accommodate me, but if Miss Stephanie Crawford was watching from her upstairs window, she would see Arthur Radley escorting me down the sidewalk as any gentleman would do. We came to the street light on the corner, and I wondered how many times Dale had stood there hugging that fat pole, watching and waiting and hoping. And I wondered how many times Jim and I had made this journey, but I entered the Radley front gate for the second time in my life. Bo and I walked up the steps to his porch. His fingers found the front doorknob. He gently released my hand, opened the door, went inside, and shut the door behind him. I never saw him again. Neighbors bring food and with death and flowers with sickness and little things in between. Boo was our neighbor. He gave us 2 soap dolls, a broken watch and chain, pair of good luck pennies, and our lives. But neighbors give in return. We never put back into the tree what we took out of it. We'd given him nothing, and it made me so sad. Is that true, guys? What did they give Arthur? I mean, come on. The one thing Arthur needed the most. That's right. Friendship. I turned to go home. The street lights winked down the street all the way to town. I'd never seen my neighborhood from this angle. Now, there was Miss Maudie's and Miss Stephanie's, and there was our house, and I could see the porch swing. Miss Rachel's house was beyond us, plainly visible. I could even see Mrs. DeBose's. Now, I looked around me, and I looked behind me, and to the left of the brown door was a long, shuttered window. I walked to it, I stood in front of it, and turned around. In daylight, I thought, you could see to the post office corner. Daylight, in my mind. The night faded. It was daytime, and the neighborhood was busy. Stephanie Crawford crossed the street to tell the latest to Miss Rachel. Miss Maudie bent over her azaleas. It was summertime, and 2 children scampered down the sidewalk toward a man approaching in the distance. The man waved, and the children raced each other to him. It was still summertime, and the children came closer. A boy trudged down the sidewalk, dragging a fishpole behind him, and a man stood waiting with his hands on his hips. Summertime, and his children played in the front yard with their friend, enacting a strange little drama of their own invention. It was fall. and his children fought on the sidewalk in front of Mrs. DeBose's. The boy helped his sister to her feet, and they made their way home. Fall. His children trotted to and fro around the corner, the day's woes and triumphs on their faces. They stopped at the oak tree, delighted, puzzled, apprehensive. Winter and his children shivered at the front gate, silhouetted against a blazing house. Winter, and a man walked into the street, dropped his glasses, shot a dog. Summer, and he watched his children's heart break. Autumn again, and Boo's children needed him. Atticus was right. One time he said, you never know a man until you stand in his shoes and you walk around in them. Just standing on the Radley porch was enough. The streetlights were fuzzy from the fine rain that was falling, and as I made my way home, I felt very old. But when I looked at the top of my nose, I could see fine misty beads, and looking cross-eyed made me dizzy, so I quit. As I made my way home, I thought, oh, what a thing to tell Jim tomorrow. He'd be so mad. He'd be so mad he missed it. He wouldn't speak to me for days. Oh, as I made my way home, I thought Jim and I would get grown, but there wasn't much else left to learn, except maybe possibly algebra. I ran up the steps and into the house. Aunt Alexandra had gone to bed, and Atticus's room was dark. I'd see if Jim might be reviving. Atticus was in Jim's room, sitting by his bed, and he was reading a book. Is Jim awake yet? Sleeping peacefully. Oh, he won't be awake till morning. Oh. Are you sitting up with him? Just for an hour or so. Go to bed, Scout. You've had a long day. Well, I think I'll stay with you for a while. Oh, suit yourself, said Atticus. It must have been after midnight, and I was puzzled by his amiable acquiescence. He was shrewder than I, however. The moment I sat down, I began to feel sleepy. Oh, what you reading? I asked, and Atticus turned the book over. Something of Jim's called the Gray Ghost. I was suddenly awake. Why'd you get that one? Well, honey, I don't know. I just picked it up as one of the few things I haven't read, he said pointedly. Oh, read it aloud, Atticus, please. It's real scary. No, he said. You've had enough scaring for a while. Well, this is Atticus. I wasn't scared. He raised his eyebrow and I protested. Leastways, not until I started telling Mr. Tate about it. Jim wasn't scared. I asked him and he said he wasn't. Besides, nothing's real scary except in books. Now, is that true? I mean, is that really true? Or is she just little enough, young enough to not realize how truly dangerous and scary that was? Think about that. Okay. Atticus opened his mouth to say something, but he shut it again. And he took his thumb from the middle of the book and he turned back to the first page. I moved over and leaned my head against his knee. He said, The Gray Ghost by Secretary Hawkins, Chapter 1. I willed myself to stay awake, but the rain was so soft. The room was so warm. And his voice was so deep and his knee was so snug that I slept. Seconds later, it seemed his shoes were gently nudging my ribs, and he lifted me to my feet and he walked me to my room. I heard every word you said, I muttered. Well, I wasn't asleep at all. It's about a ship and a three-fingered Fred and Stoner's boy. He unhooked my overalls, leaned me against him, and pulled them off, and he held me up with one hand and reached for my pajamas with the other. Yeah, they all thought it was Stoner's boy. They all thought it was Stoner's boy messing up their clubhouse and throwing ink all over it. He got him in the bed and he sat me down and he lifted my legs and he put me under the covers. Oh, and they chased him and never could catch him because they didn't know what he looked like. And Atticus, when they finally saw him, he hadn't done any of those things. Atticus, he was real nice. His hands were under my chin, pulling up the cover, tucking it under me. Most people are, Scout. Most people are when you get to know them, when you finally see them. And he turned out the light, and he went into Jem's room, and he would be there all night. And he'd be there when Jem waked up in the morning. And that's it. See, I'm a mess. And some of you asked the question as I told you what happened. Why is Miller all upset? And that's why. Because if you have to question the goodness of people, if you have to question how to be kind-hearted and open-minded, remember what I said, we all have mockingbird, or we all have blue jay moments, but we must strive to be a mockingbird. We must strive to do the best we can, to be the kindliest that we can. Because what else do we have? Look at what we're going through now. If we don't help each other, if we turn on each other, if we are not exactly in our homes as we are in our schools or on our sidewalks or at our jobs, then what is the point? Be the humanitarian. Be the good person. It's hard sometimes. There's no denying it. There's sometimes when you just want to go, I'm out. I'm angry. I'm done. I'm hurt. But you've got to see it for the bigger picture. We are all that we have. We are all that we have, and we have to be there for each other through the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have said this from the first day of school. And now my freshman babies are right about ready to fly into being sophomores. You're still my Boo Bears. You're all my Boo Radleys, because there are times for every single one of you that you struggle. You're worried about how you're perceived. You're worried about what people think about you. You want to be more than what you are in the moment. You want to grow too fast. We all have been there. We all do that. And that's why I call you Boo. Because I care about you guys. And I swear I want the best for each and every one of you. So if you learned anything, whether you liked the book or not, if you learned anything, it is to be kind, to be the mockingbird and not the blue jay, to be open-minded, open-hearted, open-willed, and be the better person. And that's all she wrote. I love you guys, and I will talk to you later.